I came home expecting a quiet afternoon and instead found my private land turned into a full-blown public event, with tents, tables, loud music, and people wandering around like they owned the place. Right in the middle of it all was an HOA woman barking orders, pointing at my property, and proudly announcing a 2-day dates exhibition as if that somehow made trespassing acceptable. What she didn't account for, what absolutely no one warned her about, was that this exact patch of land also happened to house several active beehives, and those bees were already very unhappy. By the end of that weekend, the exhibition was shut down early, the HOA was scrambling to save face, and my bees had unintentionally become the main reason the entire plan fell apart. So stick around because the way this escalated is something I still can't believe actually happened. For some context, I own a small piece of land just outside an HOA-controlled neighborhood, clearly marked, legally documented, and deliberately kept quiet because I use it for beekeeping. I'm not a troublemaker, I don't bother the HOA, and I definitely don't attend their meetings, but I've had a few run-ins before with people who think community means they can ignore private property lines. The beehives have been there for years, fully permitted and carefully maintained, and they're not aggressive unless they're disturbed, which is exactly why I keep the area calm and controlled. That's why walking onto my land and finding dozens of strangers, food smells in the air, kids running around, and an HOA representative acting like she had full authority over the space immediately set off alarm bells. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was the start of a situation where entitlement, poor planning, and nature were about to collide in a very public way. The way this all started was almost absurdly casual, which in hindsight made it even more frustrating. Apparently, the HOA had been planning this dates exhibition for weeks, advertising it as a wholesome cultural food event meant to bring the community together, but at no point did anyone think to check who actually owned the land they decided to use. From what I later found out, the HOA Karen had looked at an empty, open area next to the neighborhood and just assumed it was fair game, telling vendors and volunteers that it was basically HOA overflow space. When I confronted her and calmly explained that this was private property and that I had beehives on site, she brushed it off immediately, waving her hand and saying it was only for 2 days and that moving the bees a little farther back would be easier than causing a scene. She spoke to me like I was an inconvenience, not the landowner, insisting that the event had already been approved internally and that canceling or relocating it would make her look bad. As more people arrived, the noise increased, music started playing, and the smell of sugary foods filled the air, which was when I noticed the bees becoming noticeably more active around the hives. Things escalated quickly once the crowd hit its peak. Guests started pointing out the bees, vendors complained about insects hovering near their stalls, and someone eventually came running over saying a visitor had been stung. It wasn't serious, but it was enough to cause panic, and instead of acknowledging the obvious safety issue, the HOA Karen turned on me, loudly accusing me of endangering the community and demanding I shut down or remove the hives immediately. She claimed the HOA had authority over the area and threatened me with fines, saying she'd handle the paperwork later, all while raising her voice so everyone around could hear. I stayed calm and repeated that the land was mine, the bees were legally kept, and that the real problem was an unauthorized event being held in their space, but that only seemed to make her angrier. People began arguing, some siding with me, others just wanting the bees gone, and the atmosphere shifted from festive to tense in minutes. By that point, it was clear the situation was spiraling out of her control, and the very thing she dismissed at the start, the bees, was about to become impossible for her or the event to ignore. The turning point came when the situation crossed from uncomfortable to completely unmanageable, and it happened faster than anyone expected. As the afternoon heat rose and the crowd grew louder, the bees' behavior shifted from restless to unmistakably defensive, with more of them circling the area instead of staying close to the hives. Guests started backing away from the tables, vendors abandoned their stalls, and what had been a cheerful exhibition turned into scattered pockets of confusion and frustration. That's when someone called local authorities, and suddenly the HOA Karen's confident tone vanished. When officials arrived and asked who owned the land, she tried to jump in first, claiming it was community use property and insisting the event had HOA approval, but all it took was one look at the property markers and my documentation for that narrative to fall apart. As soon as it became clear that this was private land and that the event had no legal permission to be there, the entire mood shifted. The officials turned their attention to safety concerns, especially with the bees and the number of people present, and told her plainly that the exhibition needed to be shut down immediately. Watching her argue, interrupt, and try to shift blame onto me while being calmly shut down was surreal, especially after how dismissive she'd been earlier. Guests stood around listening, some openly criticizing the HOA for putting them at risk, others filming the confrontation on their phones. Vendors were frustrated, parents were upset, and the same people who had been praising the event just hours earlier were now demanding refunds and explanations. The moment that really sealed it was when an official stated clearly, in front of everyone, that the HOA was trespassing and liable for any injuries that occurred. You could practically feel the authority drain out of her as she realized she no longer had control of the situation. One by one, tents came down, tables were folded, and the exhibition dissolved into chaos, all while my beehives remained exactly where they had always been, untouched and protected. What struck me most was how quickly entitlement collapsed once reality stepped in, and how something she treated as a minor inconvenience ended up exposing serious negligence on her part. By the time the area cleared out, the land was quiet again, and it was obvious that this wasn't just the end of an event, it was the moment the HOA's overreach finally met a hard boundary it couldn't ignore. The real aftermath didn't begin when the tents came down or when the crowd finally left, it started the moment the HOA realized they couldn't just walk away from what they'd done. By the next morning, my phone was already blowing up with messages, emails, and voicemails, all marked urgent, all coming from people who hadn't cared to contact me before trespassing on my land. The tone was no longer dismissive or commanding, it was tight, defensive, and panicked. The HOA Karen who had confidently ordered me around the day before was suddenly requesting a conversation and asking if we could resolve this amicably. That alone told me how badly things had gone for them overnight. Vendors had complained, attendees had posted videos online, and several parents had contacted the city about safety concerns, all pointing back to one central issue: the HOA had organized a public event on private land without permission and tried to strong-arm the owner into compliance when confronted. And now, instead of controlling the narrative, they were scrambling to contain it. What followed was the most aggressive pushback I'd ever experienced, and it came wrapped in polite language and legal threats. I received a formal-looking letter accusing me of knowingly maintaining a hazardous environment and implying I was responsible for the disruption of the event, the financial losses, and even the emotional distress of attendees. They claimed the beehives constituted a public danger and suggested that if I didn't remove them voluntarily, the HOA would explore enforcement options. Reading it, I felt that familiar surge of anger, not because I doubted my position, but because of how boldly they were rewriting reality. They had trespassed, ignored warnings, endangered people, and now they were trying to flip the entire situation onto me. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to end with an apology or a quiet settlement. They were doubling down, and if I backed off even slightly, they'd do it again to someone else. So I stopped responding emotionally and started responding strategically. I gathered everything: property surveys, permits, emails, screenshots, photos of the event on my land, and videos people had posted online showing the HOA Karen asserting authority she didn't have. I contacted a lawyer, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted a record, something official that said, unmistakably, this ends here. When my lawyer sent the response letter, it wasn't long or dramatic, but it was devastating. It outlined the trespassing, the lack of permission, the safety violations, and the HOA's attempt to intimidate a landowner after the fact. It also included a notice that any further harassment or interference with my property would result in formal legal action, including claims for damages and public liability exposure. Within hours of that letter being delivered, the HOA's tone changed completely. That's when the final confrontation happened, and it wasn't behind closed doors, it was in public, at an emergency HOA meeting that residents had demanded after hearing what actually occurred. I didn't plan to attend, but my lawyer advised me to show up, say nothing unless asked, and let them dig their own hole. When I walked in, the room went quiet in a way that told me everyone already knew. The HOA Karen was at the front, visibly rattled, trying to justify her decisions, insisting she had acted in the community's best interest. But the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. Residents started asking questions she couldn't answer: why permission was never obtained, why safety warnings were ignored, why she tried to threaten a homeowner instead of admitting a mistake. Someone played a video of her yelling about HOA authority on land that wasn't even part of the neighborhood, and the shift was immediate. Murmurs turned into outright anger, and the confidence she'd wielded so freely just days earlier collapsed in real time. When the board finally turned to me and asked if I wanted to speak, I kept it simple. I explained that I had warned them, that the land was clearly marked, and that I had no interest in controlling their events, only in protecting my property and my livelihood. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't insult anyone, and I didn't exaggerate. And somehow, that calm honesty hit harder than anything else could have. The room wasn't angry at me, they were embarrassed by the HOA. One board member openly stated that the situation had exposed serious overreach and negligence, and another suggested an internal review of how authority was being exercised. That was the moment I saw the power dynamic flip completely. The same woman who had threatened me with fines was now being questioned by her own community, her credibility unraveling piece by piece. The fallout didn't stop there. Within the week, the HOA issued a written acknowledgement that my land was not under their jurisdiction and that the event had been organized without proper verification or consent. They quietly paid vendor cancellation fees and issued refunds, careful not to frame it as an admission of guilt, but everyone knew what it was. The HOA Karen stepped down from her role for personal reasons, though residents openly discussed the real cause. New policies were introduced requiring written land verification for any future events, and suddenly, property lines mattered again. It was surreal watching the same organization that had tried to bulldoze me scramble to put safeguards in place, all because they'd underestimated one person who refused to be intimidated. But the most shocking part came later, when I received a separate notice informing me that the HOA's insurer had flagged the incident as a major liability risk. If someone had been seriously injured, the financial consequences could have been catastrophic, not just for the HOA, but for individual board members involved in the decision. That realization hit harder than any argument or confrontation. This wasn't just about bees or an exhibition, it was about how casually power had been abused and how close it came to causing real harm. The entitlement that fueled the whole situation hadn't just embarrassed them, it had exposed them. Standing on my land afterward, listening to the familiar, steady hum of the hives, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief mixed with resolve. I hadn't won in the dramatic sense people imagine, but I had drawn a line that couldn't be erased, and I'd forced an organization used to getting its way to finally stop and look at the damage it caused. And just when I thought it was finally over, a single email landed in my inbox, short, carefully worded, and carrying implications that told me the real resolution was still one step away. Standing on my land now, after everything that had happened, it's hard to describe the mix of emotions I felt. Relief, sure, but also a kind of quiet vindication and an intense clarity about what it means to truly protect what belongs to you. Over the weeks following the exhibition debacle, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the bees settled back into their routines, the flowers and fruit trees thrived, and the property once again felt like a sanctuary rather than a battleground. But the lessons lingered, and the impact of that weekend extended far beyond the temporary chaos of a misguided community event. The HOA, which had acted with unchecked entitlement, had been forced to confront the limits of its authority, and that confrontation left permanent marks on how they operate. It was fascinating, in a way, to observe how quickly arrogance collapses once reality asserts itself. The people who had once waved their policies like shields now had to reckon with boundaries, consent, and accountability. They had underestimated the consequences of their actions, and the fallout from that weekend reminded them and everyone watching that no amount of assumed power can override legal ownership and personal responsibility. Immediately after the final confrontation at the emergency HOA meeting, there was a ripple effect across the neighborhood. Residents who had long tolerated overreach suddenly found themselves questioning decisions that had previously gone unquestioned. Many admitted to me in quiet conversations that they had felt uncomfortable with the way the HOA had acted, but the sense of helplessness or fear of confrontation had kept them silent. When they saw the situation resolved so definitively in my favor, it gave them the courage to speak up, to hold the organization accountable, and to insist that future events respect property rights and safety regulations. It was remarkable to see the shift. Not only had one individual successfully defended their land, but the actions taken set a precedent that would protect others as well. It was a reminder that asserting your rights doesn't just benefit you, it can create systemic change, especially when others realize that rules and authority exist to be respected, not exploited. In the weeks following the incident, the HOA implemented several long overdue reforms. Written verification of land ownership became mandatory for all events, liability assessments had to be completed before any activity near private property, and safety protocols were expanded to account for environmental factors like my beehives. Some board members even voluntarily attended workshops on property law and community ethics, which was both amusing and reassuring. For me, it was a validation of patience, preparation, and restraint. Had I responded with anger or aggression, the outcome might have been different, but by documenting everything, maintaining calm, and allowing the natural course of events to expose the HOA's overreach, I had turned a tense, potentially dangerous situation into an unambiguous victory. Watching the same people who had attempted to intimidate me navigate these new procedures was oddly satisfying. They no longer acted with impunity, and the neighborhood as a whole benefited from their reckoning. The balance of power had shifted, not through confrontation alone, but through a combination of legal clarity, strategic patience, and letting the facts speak for themselves. Personally, the experience left me with a deeper understanding of boundaries, not just physical, but psychological and social. Boundaries are what define ownership, responsibility, and respect. When they are ignored, chaos ensues, but when they are enforced with clarity and calm determination, everyone benefits. I also came to appreciate the unpredictable allies in situations like these. In my case, the bees had inadvertently played a pivotal role in enforcing my boundaries. Their natural instincts to protect their home, combined with my careful management, created a deterrent that no amount of human authority could override. The bees, in a way, became both a literal and symbolic reminder of the power of respecting limits. Nature, as it often does, intervened to enforce fairness when human systems failed. That realization gave me a sense of profound satisfaction. Sometimes the most effective force in asserting justice isn't confrontation or rhetoric, but preparation, presence, and the natural systems already at your disposal. In addition to the immediate practical lessons, the incident also forced me to reflect on the nature of authority, entitlement, and accountability. The HOA Karen represented a mindset that many of us encounter in our daily lives, an individual or organization convinced that their perspective and rules outweigh everything else, willing to override the rights of others without consideration. Watching the unraveling of that mindset in real time was both educational and cathartic. It reinforced the importance of knowing your rights, standing firm, and documenting interactions, but it also highlighted a less tangible lesson: patience and measured action often wield more power than aggression. By remaining calm and prepared, I turned a potentially volatile situation into a teaching moment for the broader community and for the HOA itself. The long-term consequence is that the neighborhood now operates with greater awareness, respect for property, and understanding of limits, a quiet victory that will continue to resonate long after the memory of the exhibition fades. Emotionally, the aftermath brought a sense of closure that was both satisfying and humbling. There was joy in seeing accountability enforced, but also a subtle appreciation for the lessons learned through tension and adversity. I now view the land differently, not just as a place for beekeeping, but as a symbol of resilience, careful stewardship, and the quiet power of standing one's ground. The bees continue their work, the flowers continue to bloom, and the space retains the calm and order I fought to protect. Yet, beneath that calm lies a story of confrontation, courage, and calculated strategy that serves as a reminder: even when faced with systemic overreach, measured action, evidence, and patience can transform what feels like a threat into an opportunity to establish long-lasting respect and change. Ultimately, the experience distilled into a single, powerful takeaway: boundaries matter, and enforcing them with clarity, documentation, and calm conviction is not just a right, it is a responsibility to oneself and to the broader community. Entitlement and overreach can only persist as long as they are tolerated, and the moment they encounter well-prepared resistance, they collapse quickly and publicly. Watching the HOA scramble to mitigate the consequences, issue acknowledgments, reform their procedures, and quietly manage their reputation reinforced that no one is above accountability, and that even organizations built on authority can be humbled when confronted with truth and persistence. In the end, the land was restored, the bees were unharmed, and the neighborhood became safer and more aware, but the most enduring victory was intangible: the clear demonstration that standing firm, preparing thoroughly, and allowing facts to speak louder than aggression is a formula for turning chaos into justice, frustration into empowerment, and conflict into lasting change. And as I stand at the edge of my property, watching the bees hum among the blossoms, I know one thing for certain: no exhibition, no board, and no overreaching authority will ever make me compromise what I've worked to protect. The lesson isn't just mine, it belongs to anyone willing to defend their space, their rights, and their principles. Respect boundaries, stay prepared, and never underestimate the quiet power of resilience, because sometimes the smallest, calmest force, like a swarm of bees, can teach the loudest lesson of all.